Hi, Benigno.
Hello, Philip.
How are you doing?
We're doing fine, thank you.
Great. Let me introduce us. I'm Philip Menchaca, Project Coordinator at Union Theological Seminary. You are Benigno Sánchez-Eppler, and this is meaningoflife.tv. Today we're going to talk about the Quakers, Quakerism, which is a Christian tradition, also known as Religious Society of Friends. And you are a member of the Northampton Friends meeting, the clerk of the section of the Americas for the Friends World Committee for Consultation, and you also do translations of Quaker texts into Spanish, which if anyone listening or watching is interested in looking at, they can go to, what's the website again?
The website is raicesquakeras.org.
Okay, we'll link to that in
thank you.
In the post. So I'd like to talk about, give people a sense of what it means to be a Quaker and some of the basic beliefs, and get into the diversity of practice in the Quaker world. This is something, when I talk about religion, I tend to always give this disclaimer that that religions have extreme internal diversity frequently. And so oftentimes, if we're giving a general overview, it's just a generalization and may not apply to any particular practice, because within even something like Christianity or Judaism or Quakerism, there's a lot of different kinds of beliefs and practices. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to just start by just asking kind of a simple, perhaps deceptively simple question of what it means to you to be a Quaker.
Well, to start from the basic possibility of bringing a family into a community of faith, it's very important for me to be able to worship with my wife and children. And when we met, initially, the woman who became my wife came from a Jewish family, not a Christian herself, and yet educated by Quakers. When I met her, she went to Quaker meeting, and after I decided that we were going to make a home, or going to try to make a home, and I started going to Quaker meeting, because it was very evident that she was going to keep going to Quaker meeting. I came from a Christian Episcopal family, and I had my youthful separations from the church. And so when I returned to the life of the Spirit in the context of a religious community, it was extremely welcoming to come through that door of Universalist Quakerism in England, actually, which is where I started going to Quaker meeting. Later on, when we moved back to the United States, we actually learned a lot more about how many different kinds of Quakers there can be. And so initially, I mean, in terms of what door or what threshold took me into Quakerism, it was a threshold marked by a wide opening welcome to searching and to questioning, and to the kind of room to doubt and to find your own direction in the life of the Spirit. And this was happening in my 20s, and it was a very, very attractive and again, welcoming. I started to feel at home very soon. By the time we moved to the United States after after going to Quaker meeting in England for 2 years, it was very easy to go into the nitty-gritty of membership and committee work, and into the reality of having a ecclesial governance that everybody does without much of a hierarchy. And we can talk about that in more detail.
Yeah. So, would you describe Quaker, the structure of the Quaker Church is what sounds like for you? It's faith is very much about community, and is the structure of the Quaker Church also? You said, is it non-hierarchical? You mentioned these committees. Are those the governing structures? I don't want to go too deep in this, but just to give some background about how the church functions.
I think this is probably a good time to start looking a little bit at the historical backdrop. Mm-hmm. Quakerism is born in the middle of very hard political, cultural, social times in England. It is one of the fruits of English Commonwealth, English Civil War, in fact. And so by the middle of the 17th century, after about 100 plus, less than 150 years of Reformation, there is a discontent with the Reformation itself. And Quakerism emerges as a kind of a reform to the Reformation in some respects.
So it was a split from even the emergence of Protestantism.
And again, it's not the experience of the Quaker birthing, so to speak, is not really experienced as a split from anything, because the people who come into Quakerism are actually going through a period of pretty freewheeling non-conformism, the lack of conformism of that period. A group that call themselves seekers in a very radical way, and then Quakerism under the leadership of George Fox and others, not just George Fox. They start finding. And they find, most of all, the presence and the living energy and the living love of that of God inside of everyone.
So Quakers, are they like other kinds of Protestant where they believe in the priesthood of all believers? That is, everyone has or can experience a personal relationship with God. You don't need any kind of mediator, like in the Catholic Church where I was raised. You have a priest, and he kind of acts as the go-between you and God, and that's not really how it works in Quakerism.
The shorthand of the priesthood of all believers is definitely in play. Mm-hmm. Another way of saying it is that there's no laity in the Quaker movement. And yet, once we get into the details of how authority works, because it's not like there's no sense of authority. Mm-hmm. The sense of authority comes from a double realization. First, the realization that God can speak directly to the individual, right? If you take that to a radical extreme, and everybody is asserting that God speaks to them individually, the group or whoever gathers under that certainty is going to get unwieldy very quickly. And that is the experience of the 17th century ranters in particular. They assert, God speaks to me directly, and may speak to you directly. And there may be no real mechanism to put those two voices together. In Quakerism, very early on, that certainty is put together with the other certainty, which says, quite radically, that God speaks directly to the gathered meeting as well. And so
it's not just the individual, but it's the community as well.
But it's both.
It's both.
It's both. God speaks directly to the individual, good, but also, and perhaps more radically, God speaks directly to the gathered meeting. And then when the gathered meeting sits, mostly in the silence to listen, and friend stands to speak what he or she has heard, and it's important, she is a possibility from very early in the 17th century. It's another radical departure.
Yeah, that's not always true in religion.
But it's again, but we'll go back to that, because that actually marks the first. I think that actually marks the first politically, socially visible fact of universality, that women can be it as well and can do it. But we'll come back to that. So the meeting as a group can say to an individual, we hear what you're saying, that you've heard from the Spirit, but right now, at this moment, that doesn't necessarily go together with what the group is hearing at the point. And there are mechanisms by which the group, some people would say disciplines, others would say trusts, others would say, for the group to be pretty certain about what they're hearing as the will of God. And so going into how that happens, that would be detailed.
Yeah.
Very important ones, and we can go into that direction.
Yeah. Is it kind of a democratic process of some kind? I don't want to get too much into like the governance.
But this is interesting. It is definitely not democratic, because it is essentially theocratic. And by the way, modern liberal Quakers have a problem with that formulation, because they are living a Quakerism that has come to be quite democratic. It is theocratic because the whole group is listening for the will of God for them at that moment. And there are ways of sitting down to wait, and there are ways of giving up ways or disciplines to give up the individual's interests, and for each individual to focus on what the Spirit may be saying for the group to unite on. And there are disciplines for each individual to realize, oh, I may be interested in this. But the point is not to take all of our interests and come up with an arrangement or a consensus or a compromise. No, the point is to listen and to see what God is calling us to do, and to unite on that. And that the experienced Quaker practitioner often recognizes that it's not what the individual will would recognize as his or hers.
Yeah. This seems to get to an interesting theological question, though. If you have an individual who feels God is intending them to do one thing, but then the group another, is there any tension between that? A sense that people are experiencing two different wills of God, so to speak, that God is saying two contradictory things, perhaps? How is that reconciled?
Well, the major factor in the discipline involves a combination of trust and love. So there's always a trust that the one person or the two people who are saying, no, I'm not hearing what the rest of the group is saying. There is a trust that they're speaking from a sense that goes beyond their personal interest. Mm-hmm. At some point, or initially when that happens, the gathering is content, particularly if those friends have experience and have standing in the decision-making process. We're not talking about priesthoods, right? But we're talking about length of experience. We're talking about, because love and trust are realities or affects that get practiced in time. So, and so the meeting can say, we cannot move forward with the sense of what this great majority is expressing, because we're happy to be tender with the two friends who are not seeing it. And so at that moment, the gathering is content to say we cannot come to unity. But not coming to unity also triggers a willingness to, as we say it in the traditional 17th century language, to labor together in love. And so that means that we're going to keep talking about it, and we're going to be continuing to express our certainties from both sides, and at some point, the spirit, the capacity to pray together, the capacity to have the winds of the Spirit change our minds and hearts, sometimes operates on the two individuals or on the whole group. and there has been, and by the way, coming to unity as often as we do it for the regular business of our church maintenance, and also for the adoption of public corporate action that Quaker meetings can take. It is, I think, one of the best and most reliable repeated miracles that we participate in over and over again. What happens when unity opens up to action is that we never have a minority of either disenfranchised, disaffected, or even foot-dragging members in our congregations, in our meetings, who are not with the sense of the meeting.
And is that because you've gone through this process to come to unity? Exactly. And you don't move forward until you're at that point when everyone's on board.
We don't move forward until we declare unity. B, unity does not have to be unanimity. Mm-hmm. That's very clear. I mean, there are times when, the group can discern undue stubbornness on particular friends, or the group can discern a particular sourness, or
but there's trust once you reach. There's trust once you reach unity that then the whole group will move forward as one. Is that the idea?
That is the essence, and there are ways to labor together in love when there are differences, and there are ways of responsibly saying we have to move. Mm-hmm. This friend who's standing in the way or not there yet can forgive us. That's one way of proceeding. Or he or she is in a particular condition right now where he cannot join us, or his or she is stubborn and contumacious. We can say those things inside the tradition, and it's not easy. And we don't. That's not the norm. But when the norm is to wait until the whole group can move together, and so that we can move without a minority of disaffection, or a minority of distrust, or a minority of discontent. It's it sounds very difficult, and I'm finally convinced, or I've been convinced for a while, that it is only difficult in human terms. But it is only difficult if you're saying that unity is an agreement of human interests. But if you come under the weight of unity is all of us hearing what God is calling us to do, which may not have anything to do with what we want to do individually, right? Then if you hold on to that certainty, unity is actually not that hard. It's what God gives us, you know? and in a sense, unity is like grace. It's not ours. It's the Lord's. It's the Spirit's, and we come into it, and we become open to it, you know, and that is the beauty of Quakerism. Many meetings will do this process. Many newcomers will find themselves in unity because the meeting is doing what they want to do. Mm-hmm. Many newcomers will run into trouble when they want something and the meeting doesn't necessarily go that way. And many newcomers then have to be helped to know the difference between living in a community that's full of affinity, social, political, cultural, right? Yeah. Where consensus is possible, or where agreement is possible. But soon enough, and with good eldering, with good respect, the newcomer comes to realize that unity is not agreement as such.
Okay. I think this would be a good time, actually, if you could walk me through what a Quaker service is like. And, you know, like I said, coming from the Catholic Church, I have a sense, whenever I think of, like, church service, I think of you say certain things at certain times, and you have a priest, and they say this, and you do the same things every service. But what is it like to come into a Quaker meeting, to come into a church?
Well, actually, I'm gonna take the linguistic opportunity here to come in at it differently. Uh-huh. You asked about Quaker service.
Yeah.
Actually, Quaker service, it's a very clear thing. Quaker service is the work Quakers do in the world. To serve that, yeah. And Quaker service is related often to what we come to recognize as traditional testimonies, things that we have been corporately interested in doing. We have come to be known for our peace work. Mm-hmm. We've come to be known for our education contributions. We've come to be known for 19th century abolitionism, although Quakers were slave owners in the 17th and for the first half of the 18th century. So Quaker service, I'm just smiling because Quaker service is what you do out there in the world.
The actual actions one takes.
Exactly. And the individuals will do Quaker service just following a personal leading or a way of doing their career with and sort of informed by this sense that you go out there because there's that of God in you that wants to work through you, and there's that of God in others that you want to respond to. Mm-hmm. And that leads to Quaker service. The word meeting for Quakerism, it's something that they pick up quite militantly from the 17th century nonconformists. When you say the word meeting in the 17th century, you're basically not saying liturgy. with time, the repetition of practice does become recognizable. As something that gets repeated. I don't have any problems recognizing that there is such a thing as Quaker ritual, right? We remain, by and large, quite committed to the way in which the meeting, it's not a liturgy. Although it would be very hard to deny that it does have all the components of a ritual, the meaningful repetition of things that lead you closer to the life of the Spirit.
And what are some of the rituals that are practiced in, I know it probably varies from meeting to meeting, but in your personal...
Right. Now I have to make the historical parentheses, and in fact, maybe I will answer that question. But that question has different Quaker answers because there are different ways of living the Quaker heritage, particularly with respect to worship. In the 19th century, Quakerism split in a variety of ways, again, affected by the different waves of the religious awakening in the United States. There were some things happening with evangelical movements in England that were very important to Quakerism as well. But the divisions actually were a gift of American Quakerism to the world, so to speak. And out of those divisions, we have, some would say 3, some would say 4, particularly different ways of being a Quaker with specific distinctions in terms of the structure of worship. So, on one hand, you have the contemporary airs of the silence in worship, and on the other hand, you have evangelical Quakerism that has adopted all of the particulars of evangelical worship, from the centrality of the preaching of the word, to the centrality of Scripture, to the possibility of having singing ministries and very carefully programmed worship with very little or no silence as a part of their tradition, and that's what comes under the label of evangelical Quakerism.
So you have, it seems, on the two ends of the extremes, you have one where they're very much more rooted in the original kind of worship, where you have a group that comes together, and do they wait in silence until various members?
I'll get to the particulars of that. I'll get to the particulars of that, but I want to make sure that the possible differences in the spectrum are quite clear. If you come a little bit, so in the spectrum, the wings of the spectrum right now are this evangelical, scripture-based, pastor-grounded, programmed worship, somewhat recognizable as what you might find in any evangelical congregation all over the world. As you come to the other side of the spectrum, you will go through mixes and matches, right? The other side of the spectrum, I still want to call up the modern extreme of the other side of the spectrum, which is potentially, oh, by the way, and that evangelical extreme is radically and livingly Christian and Christ-centered. And missionary in its force. On the other side of the extreme, you have the essential heirs of the search in the silence for the presence of God. The silence, the liberal options in liberal Quakerism, and the universalist openings of liberal Quakerism can leave the silence as the liturgical core of a gathering where people who may not have a particular commitment or experience of God or the divine or Jesus Christ as a presence are still welcome to come and are still recognized as full participants in the life of the Spirit, or even if they don't claim the Spirit as a presence in their lives, but they're welcome and they are co-participants and they can take up important functions in the life of the church management and governance. But that part of the spectrum can harbor and make coherent a strong range of non-theist possibilities. That the fact that non-theism does fit in some Quaker meetings in that part of the extreme, or in that particular extreme, doesn't preclude the recognition that Quakerism remains a historically Christian tradition, but it has nevertheless gone to the extreme where non-theists are welcome and participants. That makes for a very strong, what I call, and again, this is my analysis and some other friends, that makes for a very strong and very tender spiritual refuge for people who have had particular damaging experiences with religion. And so those Quaker meetings are often very highly committed to playing down the traditional Quaker content of Christianity, of religious discipline, of internal spiritualization, for the sake of creating or maintaining a safe community of faith where non-theists, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, can come in and become a gathering, sharing the silence as the space where worship becomes possible among them. And there are meetings that take that universalist opening quite militantly as the content and context, or the contentless and context that they want to protect the most. Mm-hmm. And so it is in many ways, those meetings are Quakerism's gift to the people who have been damaged by religious language, religious practices, religious extremes that they've experienced as damaging, and they find in the silence, they find in the lack of doctrinal insistence, a kind of freedom to be a gathered spiritual community or a gathered community of faith, mm-hmm. but with the whole core of the specificity of what that spirit may be, or where that spirit may come from, or what the history of that development has been kind of vacated or ceded in some way to that possibility. It is beautiful. It is the perfect foil for defining the spectrum between the evangelical modality and then there's everything else in the
between.
Quakerism.
So this raises the question, what holds all of that together as Quakers when you have such differences?
Actually, before, I'm sorry, every time you ask a question, I'm kind of postponing the answer. But I want to talk a little bit more about the rest of the spectrum. And again, sometimes it's easier to visualize the spectrum as a fan. Sometimes it isn't a fan. Sometimes it's a spiral, like, you know, it's a spiral that meets at the end, or it isn't so. Sometimes it is so clearly two-dimensional.
Right, you don't have clear borders necessarily between different forms.
But let me talk about the middle for a little bit, because let me talk about the middle, and let me talk about the Friends World Committee for Consultation, because that's an important part of what I do, and it helps a lot to flesh out the challenges of Quakerism and the opportunities that Quakerism structures. In the middle, you have Christ-centered Friends churches where you will find a program worship where this non-laity, where the sense of there may be a pastor, right? But the pastor is not necessarily the human repository of authority. The pastor is a servant of the monthly meeting. The monthly meeting is the highly congregationalist repository of authority. The pastor is a servant. The presiding clerk of that highly congregationalist body will be hearing in a silent meeting for worship, for business, what the will of the Spirit is for the group, right? And someone who's not the pastor will be directing worship and will be the one calling the pastor to present the reading and the lesson. And then after the lesson, there will be a long, silent worship section, 10 minutes to half an hour, you know, where everybody else can receive a message and stand and deliver it, just like the pastor had.
Okay.
So and that is, in many ways, there's something really attractive about that. And I cannot call it a hybrid, right? Because it's not a mixing of anything. It is an evolution of something coherent, given the different needs that Quakerism has found in different parts of the history. So that's one thing. You got the evangelical, totally programmed, high authority of the priest. High authority of the pastor. No. High authority of the Bible. You have the combination of programmed and non-programmed worship in a coherent setting. You have the Christocentric, Christocentric Christian universalist. Christian universally means that Christ saved everybody, but still Christ that saved them. Does that make sense? Christ,
the Christ figure is important.
The Christian universalism of conservative Quakerism still asserts, as early Friends did, that Christ died for everybody, whether they know it or not, right? And so that universalism, it's specifically Christian, still operates in the full ignorance of the historical Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it still is Christian universalism, right? And the conservative friends are militantly unprogrammed. They are militantly non-pastoral. They have a very coherent sense of the authority of the elder, and they have a very coherent sense of the obedience of the minister, and they differentiate those things. And those are old, almost 18th century, late 17th century, core of the 18th century pietistic experience of classical Quakerism. So there are those, and then there are the liberal friends, which can extend, which have a lot of these other two parts of the middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Less program, right? But also the possibility of welcoming and engaging non-theists and people from other non-Christian traditions.
And so a completely non-programmed meeting would look like the second half of what you described as the middle, where anyone can stand up and deliver, and there's a long silence, and they sit together.
Right, and there's how should we say? There's a high proportion of educated people in the world who will hear Quakerism and who have read the histories and heard about the contribution, the social contributions of Quakers and stuff like that. They will be thinking about this unprogrammed,
Right.
silent base, non-voting, unity-seeking, high respect for as much of the individual contribution as possible. And so that would be the tendency to. Mm-hmm. So there is something like, it's contentious among Quakers to talk about classical Quakerism, right? Particularly after the 19th century. But that's what people would recognize.
Yeah.
The silent pacifist, and now I can talk about what's the structure of that worship. So having heard that there are different kinds of Quaker worship, the structure of that worship that most people would
some kind of common.
Right.
When someone thinks Quaker, what does that look like?
The room doesn't have any particular weight of sacredness. The room itself, it's a very simple room. If anything, iconoclastic. Nothing. As close to nothing as possible.
We're not talking arches and stained glass windows.
Certainly not. We're talking about plain benches or chairs in a circle, or ideally, there would be a rotation of friends who know what's supposed to be happening and who have care of meeting. Mm-hmm. And they would come in early, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, no less than 5 minutes before the announced time for beginning. And they would settle the meeting, which means that they would enter into worship 15 to 10 minutes before most of the people start to arrive to worship. Mm-hmm. They are modeling or practicing what everybody else will enter into as they come and sit.
I see.
The silence is the initial invitation. If you're looking at the practice externally, you would see the elders or the friends who have care of meeting showing up early, sitting, then you get everybody else coming. There's usually on outside the door, there is a welcoming friend who will help you get in as quickly to starting time as possible, and depending on the meeting, will stop the flow of latecomers.
So you get
It will stop the flow of latecomers for about 15 minutes, and then in a classical move, that welcoming friend will open the door 10, 15 minutes into the worship, so that there will be one interruption of that initial gathering, a moment. Some meetings go to a good deal of house and grounds trouble to oil the hinges and
so
oil
it's not
the hinges
disruptive.
and to leave seats for latecomers close to the doors so that the latecomers can flow as quietly as possible into place. But that marking of the possibility that you will arrive and something is already started, that you're going to have to wait a little bit before you join it, right? I think that marks some of the expectations of what would be happening inside. So again, let's focus on the external experience of what you might see. So you see these odd issues at the door, but when you're focusing on the gathering, you're seeing 6, 20, 70 people quietly sitting either in a circle or in a horseshoe, depending on the tradition of the meeting, and they would be generally eyes closed in a position that is recognized by most people as some sort of prayerfulness. In the more liberal gatherings, you might see someone who has gone all the way to adopting some of the Eastern outward stances for meditation. That's
You
not
mean
so,
like hand gestures, like what are called mudras, something like
yeah,
that?
and you can find that. You can find that, and particularly in some of the more universalist meetings. But that's not necessarily the demeanor. It's mostly quiet, eyes down, eyes closed, often internal prayer. You will see, if you're just hovering and looking at, you will see sometimes in 20 minutes. Sometimes 25, you will see one friend rising and saying something. I'm not going to talk about the nature of the saying or what's possible. And that friend will sit down. Very rarely does that something exceed the 2 or 3 minute length. And the point is mostly to recognize that everybody can receive the message and everybody can deliver it. But to make that possible, practically, you can't have, 7 people delivering a 10-minute message, right? So that's
You'd be there forever. You'd never leave.
So if you keep looking externally, by the end of the hour, you will see one experienced looking friend raise his or her eyes and looking around and sensing the possibility that a message may be coming, or that in a sense friends are ready to rise. And then that friend has the authority to shake hands with the friend next to him or her, and that is the sign of closing of worship. A totally silent meeting is regarded as a great boon, a great favor of the Spirit
when nobody talks at all.
Right, when nobody talks, it can happen, and it's received far from sort of spiritual inactivity. It's received as a great sign of discipline and
the blessed silence.
Exactly, and so that's those are the but usually you get 2, 3, 4. By the time you go over 5 messages in one meeting, you start running into the negative judgment that you're heading into what's called the popcorn meeting.
Where you have just people one after another jumping up and talking.
So I don't know what that gives you a view of the externals. I mean, but I think once you have the possibility of different kinds of externals, I think it's now possible to talk about what's happening or what may be happening internally.
Yeah.
And that is where Quakerism gets both rich and highly personal, but also where Quakerism demands a whole lot more discipline that you might surmise if you're told, oh, we're sitting in the silence, and whenever somebody has something to say, they get up and say it, you know. So internally, you're asked to come in on time. You're asked to come in somehow prepared. And preparation is definitely not prepared to say something. It's actually prepared to give up all of the wheelings and all of the intents and all of the needs that you might have in your head, so that you might be able to listen to something fresh or something new or something unexpected.
It sounds almost like a meditative state.
At some level.
Where you're not attaching to various thoughts and feelings as you would that you do in a normal daily basis.
Right. By the way, if you are troubled, it is appropriate for you to enter into prayer asking for peace, or it's appropriate for you to enter into prayer requesting the message you need. Not necessarily a private message from the Spirit to you, although that's an important thing to listen to, but that the Spirit may give somebody else what you need to hear. And so there's a lot of praying for, we're here to listen. I can hear something individually. I have to test it. Is this I am hearing for me? And it could be, and you hear it. You hear it, it's for you. If it's for you, there are usually implications of possible transformations, possible redress, and then it's just for you. You are also asked to consider whether what you've just heard needs to be heard by anybody else.
And that would be when you would
And that would be when you say yes to that one. It's when you then not just do it because you have to, or do it because it's a good idea, or do it because it's eloquent, or do it because it's it's the good advice for the moment. No, you do it because you are letting yourself be an instrument of the Spirit. It is the Spirit that will speak to the gathering through what you're saying. It's interesting because it is that moment where the secular first reaction is, gee, do you really think you're ever worthy to be an instrument of,
Right. You must have a pretty high opinion of yourself.
Of the Spirit. I mean,
yeah.
And again, in traditional Quakerism, 17th century, 18th century, you really don't get up if you can't say at the end of it. If you can't say at the end of it, "Thus saith the Lord," you just don't get up. That's like, yeah, if you have a social advice, cultural insight, you can do that some other place. But and by the way, in modern Quakerism, a lot of people do rise to say the interesting thing, the socially edifying thing, the politically imperative, something. So there's room in the silence for all those things. The expectation, it's otherwise. I mean, the elders do have a responsibility to teach that every now and then, either by example or with actual teaching.
So it should be more. It's social or political messages, you might say, for example, are not excluded, but there should be more to it than that.
Right. I mean, but
included, yeah.
Right. But just as get in a donkey and go in through the other door of Jerusalem might be seen as a political protest
Sure.
against the Roman Empire. And the interesting thing is that all of these expectations are backed by a tradition and are mediated by the friends with experience, and they ought to be mediated through the friends with experience with a remarkable dose of tenderness for the inexperienced, for the newcomer who will read the signs a little bit off, for the newcomer who will not be taught directly and will nevertheless be expected to catch the drift, and again, and that's where Quaker meetings go at it differently, some more coherently than others. We have to talk about what needs to happen before people start doing what they think ought to happen, but we cannot close the door to what somebody may be called to do in distress or in and it's quite interesting. The Quaker meeting is very vulnerable to either high spiritual needs or high spiritual disturbances in individual minds, or plain old difficulties with public expression and mental health. It's a kind of space that can be misinterpreted as a kind of open door for things that aren't really the point.
Right.
So that, and then, but they're supposed to be elders
Who kind of direct that, and
they're identified or willing to respond. To take those things into.
So we're almost out of time. Can we turn to the Friends World Committee? Because I think that is one of the things that, when I asked this question about kind of what holds all these different varieties of Quakers together, I think that may be one of the things that does.
Right. So most excuse me. We know what the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth did to Judaism. We know what the ministry of Paul did to the work of the Jerusalem elders. We know what monastic practices did to regular church practice. We know what the Reformation did to the one Catholic and Apostolic Church. And then, when the middle of the 17th century comes into England, we have Quakerism actually coming up with a very, very forceful objection to Calvinist sense of predestination.
Mm-hmm.
Very anti-predestination. The Quakers were outraged that God could be defined that way. The Quakers were outraged that there would be no possibility of sanctification, that sin would always be with us. Things like that, and so Quakerism initially wasn't intended to be a different sect. It would just be something to reignite early Christianity into the Reformation. And so initially, Quakerism has a very radical birth and a multitudinous, charismatic explosion. There were moments in the 17th century in England where 1/10 of the population was Quaker, which is a lot of people.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was so large.
And then they get decriminalized because they were criminalized. There's a possibility. There's two possibilities. By the end of the 17th century, there's a possibility of laying low. You're no longer criminalized. You still there's still prejudice against you, right? But you can figure out how to live a separatist life, and then there's the possibility of living as a Quaker in the colonies,
Mm-hmm.
either in New England, together with very serious and devoted theological enemies, namely the Baptists in Rhode Island, whose sense of freedom of religion included having the Quakers there in Rhode Island, as people that they had to put up with because they believed in freedom of expression. That's Roger Williams. Roger Williams and George Fox did not get along, but Roger Williams insisted that Quakers could come and live in Rhode Island with the Baptists. And then a little later on, the Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania, where actually Quakers become, as I like to call it, they become the Constantinian Church, because Quakerism becomes the religion of the state, the colony of Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
And part of their policy is to welcome all sorts of nonconformist Mennonites, Brethren. They make a deal with the Catholics down in Maryland. They learn to live with all Hussites, you name it. They're welcoming. And so in the Americas, you can have a place to run the world as a holy experiment. By the time the 18th century comes, Quakers have to give up the colony because they don't want to defend it, right? They don't want to defend it with weapons.
Right.
And the French and their indigenous allies are attacking, and somebody has to defend that frontier. And the Quakers say, no, we won't do that. But then the other colonies say, well, let us do it. And that's how Quakers give up the government of Pennsylvania. Things move on. And then in the 19th century, what happened to all the other religions happened to Quakerism as well. There's the expansion towards the west, the new territory, new cultural patterns, new social patterns. You need different kinds of ecclesial structure to cover that kind of a territory. And so between one thing and the other, there's the issue with slavery. There's all sorts of ways of saying, oh, you can do Quakerism like that here. and you can do Quakerism like this here, and then put all those differences together with the militant assertion of the independence of the monthly meeting, the local group. You have a proliferation of divisions and the kind of, I call it a kind of Darwinian paradise where variation can evolve very fast. And
so you have all these new social pressures coming in and changing the way different Quakers worship.
Right, with the, and sort of proliferated by differences between the city and the country. In England, Quakers are mostly an urban thing, and so. But they're in the United States and in the colonies. There's rural Quakers, there's city Quakers, there's Midwestern Quakers. There, and it keeps going like that. So by the time the 1820s come around, those divisions start getting acknowledged and unresolved, and different organizational ways of organizing Quakerism start becoming recognized in different places, and one part of Quakerism starts telling the other part, no, you're not Quaker, we are the Quakers. So that kind of schematic possibility becomes a kind of norm, not in England, but definitely in the United States. There's two moments in the 19th century, and I can show you the branches, right? But you can get to that spectrum that I was talking about initially. And mostly you have very intense family kind of feuds where denying each other its point of identity, not marrying each other, it's the point of social policing and the primary factor of social replication.
So you're heading towards a breakdown and creation of tribalism and different Quaker.
Or you can call it tribalism, you can call it a different kind of denominationalism. But what you have by the time World War I hits the European scene and the American scene, you have Quakers who haven't sat with each other for half a century and more, and with very clear patterns of disownment and all that. And at that moment, World War I, World War II, something happens that I think it's quite remarkable. The young men who have been told, those are not Quakers, those are not Quakers, those are not Quakers, start to meet each other inside of this ferment of something that belonged to all of them, which is basically the call for conscientious objection in reaction to the wars. And so at that time, in that part of the 20th century, Quakers of all stripes start meeting up in the alternative service camp that one particular brand of Quakers were allowed to put together, or in the ambulance corps that different parts of England or the United States were allowed to offer as alternative service. And so once you're in the front, once you're out of your meeting, once you're in this part of the world that has you isolated as a kind of political pariah, right? But coming up with a very coherent service that is grounded on your convincement that you will not carry weapons, right? So all of a sudden, these young men started meeting each other as conscientious objectors.
They had a shared status.
And they all they all realized that they were calling each other. We're all doing this because they were all Quakers. And at the same time discovering that, my parents told me never to fuss with the likes of you. Okay? So out of that, in that particular age group, there is a revolutionary breakdown of the divisions, because, we are being faithful to something that Quakerism gave all of us, right? And, grandparents are just crazy, right?
You start seeing the other person as a person.
And the stories told about the inevitable. They meet at the ambulance corps, they meet at this food distribution project, they meet and then they go back home and they meet their sisters. And hell breaks loose, so by 1937, a very strong and coherent group of these young people start saying, we're not going to be able to undo the divisions going backwards, but we're not going to be able to bring our parents together, but we can figure out ways of moving forward so that we can talk to each other. And in 1937, so the service, the large international organization for service, like the American Friends Service Committee, is born out of that ferment.
And that's the organization that does a lot of kind of social justice work, right?
Based in the United States.
In the United States,
there's a parallel organization like that in England, Quaker Home Service. By 1947, these young men and these organizations are actually receiving a Nobel Peace Prize jointly for the food distribution and the feeding of all victims of the wars, regardless of affiliation or nationalism. And so that group of young people gets to develop a very visible and spiritual and worldly, both effectiveness about how to carry a ministry. And so they start saying, we're just going to put together these organizations that are going to create opportunities for meeting each other again and denying the denials, so to speak.
Right. Bringing together Quakers of different...
And so American Friends Service Committee is for service. The Friends World Committee for Consultation is for fellowship. Mm-hmm. We don't exert... the word consultation there sounds weird, right? But it is the glue. We only meet to consult with each other. We don't... Whatever comes out of the consultation doesn't... turn into doctrinal imposition on any other independent members of the fellowship. And so from that moment on, there was a willingness for different kinds of Quakers to start talking to each other. The outliers continued to be resistant to it, and later on, more of the outliers started getting together. By the time you get to the 1960s, and by the time the resistance to the Vietnam War makes Quakerism a real glue of the peace movement in a coherent, nonviolent way, by the time you put that together with the decolonizing of the emerging sense of a third world and stuff like that, all of the missionary branches of Quakerism had actually taken Quakerism out into the third world, Latin America, and essentially, most importantly, in Kenya, in Africa. And so, Kenyan Friends and Bolivian Friends, for example, make tens of thousands of Quakers that come out of the missionary movement, right? And you put all these together, the unifications, the reunifications, the peace, the social service international entities, the emphasis on North-South dialogue, and then there is a kind of like an obligation from a left-leaning liberal, silent universalist Quakerism to recognize that there is a majority of Quakers in Kenya that are evangelical, socially conservative, and nevertheless, like a third world carrier of Quakerism that we want to be in conversation with. And so the Friends World Committee gets a lot of those energies of wanting to talk to each other, sometimes across ministries, sometimes across these ideological divides, but most of all under some recognition that if we have a peace testimony and all of a sudden we have been favored with an intra-denominational landscape that in fact provides all of the parties to cultural wars and ideological differences. You can imagine.
The diverse ideologies all brought together.
And economic asymmetries and you name it. Gee, wouldn't it be great to come up with some sort of peace space to worship together and to come to understand how the divisions came about, come to free ourselves from the ultimately worldly and external imperatives of those divisions, and to seek perhaps the internal coherence of the call to the life of the Spirit that all of the branches are still living under. And
so that's the kind of work that the World Committee for the Friends World Committee for Consultation does, correct?
Exactly, because the service organizations remain affiliated with particular countries. The American Friends Service Committee is a United States concern. The Quaker Home Service is a British concern. There are other gatherings. The Friends United Meeting. Friends United Meeting is the gathering of the evangelical sort of perhaps more theologically liberal middle of the map. Evangelical Friends churches is over there, but none of those are international enough to provide one of the things that once the Friends World Committee is formed, we actually provide very visible and possibility, namely the possibility of representation, denominational representation in the United Nations. And so the Quaker United Nations office, it's not a dependency of the Friends World Committee for Consultation, but the Quaker United Nations offices implements the NGO status that the Friends World Committee for Consultation can secure for Quaker work in the United Nations. And so once the Friends World Committee for Consultation provides that international backing, a gathering that is actually widely international, right? Then the American Friends Service Committee can do the specific administration of the New York Quaker United Nations office, and the British social services Quaker organizations can back the Geneva Quaker United Nations office. And so it's a very odd and tender relationship, right? But for the first time, or it was it was possible for Quakers to be as active as they've become, both in peace issues, in children's anti-conscription work, specifically with
and all this was kind of
population.
made possible and coordinated by the Friends World Committee because it was this coming together.
Well, actually, it's even more beautiful than that. The Friends World Committee allows the Quakers to have offices in the United Nations, and the Quaker United Nations offices have a administratively independent way of doing that, but representing Quakers in relationship with the entry that the Friends World Committee provides for the Quakers in United Nations, and all our ministries, all our testimonies base concerns that they can carry. The Friends World Committee for Consultation is not the Quaker United Nations offices, but the Quaker United Nations office can be because they have a relationship with us.
Right. Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think we should probably wrap up.
Yes, the one thing that I would like to say to wrap up, and particularly because that last part of the history and the attempt at explaining the reasons for being of the Friends World Committee Consultation got to be so, well, in a sense, practical. And our contemporary way of being in the world but not of the world, as William Penn wanted to help us be. I just want to go back to the spiritual core of the Quaker options. We are what we are because we can sit together in the presence, because that presence speaks to the individual in the individual's heart, and because the presence speaks to the gathering, and the gathering that comes together as community at whatever that gathering holds to be its heart. It's not an easy practice spiritually or institutionally. Mostly because it makes every one of us responsible for what's going to happen, but it helps. It has helped me and my family negotiate, live under all sorts of possibilities of being together in spirit, and not at all focusing on what might have divided us, what might have made that impossible. And so to focus on that dwelling has to be where we go back to again. Again, is an indwelling in the individual, an indwelling in the community, and a capacity to put those two things together in some sort of traffic between the freedom and the obedience.
Oh, great. Well, I will leave you with the last word there. Thanks so much. This was informative and interesting, and feel like there's a lot more to learn here as well. So thanks for taking the time, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Philip.
All right. Bye, Benigno.